Can China rise peacefully? And the simple answer is yes.
With regard to the question whether China can rise peacefully, I think the answer is no. And the end result will be that you'll get this intense security competition with a serious chance of war.
大家好，我是老吴。今天这期节目想和大家分享一段非常精彩的对话片段。这是由澳大利亚一家智库举办的一场辩论，主题是中国的崛起以及由此引发的全球格局变化。参与这场辩论的是两位在国际关系领域极具影响力的思想家，一位是马凯硕，常看我们频道的朋友应该对他都不陌生，这里就不做介绍了。另一位是来自美国芝加哥大学的著名政治学教授约翰·米尔斯海默，他是当代现实主义关系理论的重要代表。他的著作《大国政治的悲剧》被誉为是后冷战时代最有影响力的学术著作之一。米尔斯海默以其对大国博弈的犀利分析而广为人知。在这场辩论中，两位嘉宾首先围绕两个核心问题展开交锋：一、中国能否和平崛起；二、中国是否正在胜出。他们在这两个问题上的立场截然不同。随后讨论深入到澳大利亚在中美博弈中的角色，西方应该如何应对日益强大的中国，以及台湾等一系列敏感但关键的话题。他们的讨论虽然态度友好，但观点碰撞却十分激烈。接下来让我们一起来看看这场精彩的思想交锋。
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be back with John and you in this discussion. Let me quickly answer your two questions. Your first one is, can China rise peacefully? And the simple answer is yes. Because one point I emphasize in my book, Has China Won, is that we are entering a new era of world history. 200 years of Western domination of world history is coming to an end, and we're returning to the norm of the first 1800 years. From the year 1 to the year 1820, two largest economies were always those of China and India. So we're going back to a different world. And remember that when China was dominant, the number one power for most of 1800 years, China didn't conquer the world. China didn't go out like the British, the French, the Dutch and the Spanish conquering colonies all over the world. Indeed, I believe in the 15th century, they had the largest, most powerful navy under Emperor Cheng He. They went around the world. They didn't conquer any countries. So I think that's a very critical point to bear in mind, with just one minor qualification. And this is important for an Australian audience. As China is rising and returning, it's important that we try to work with China rather than try to provoke China. And that's why managing the rise of China is very critical. Your second question is, can China win? And the question is, win what? So clearly, if you mean in terms of can China become the world's largest economy, I can confidently say yes. And all that the Chinese have to do is achieve half the per capita income of the United States, and they will have an economy twice the size of the United States. Simple mathematics. But of course, if by can China win, do you mean that China will step in and take over the role of the United States and try and dominate the world? I don't think China wants to do that. And as John Mearsheimer, who's going to speak next, has brilliantly documented in his book, The Great Delusion, America fought a lot of unnecessary wars in the Middle East and elsewhere. This is something that China, I'm reasonably confident, is not interested in doing. It wants to focus on making China a great power, but not take over America's role in terms of managing the world.
Kishore, thank you. And over to John Mearsheimer.
Thank you, Tom, for inviting me to be on the show. It's great to be back with you and also with my old friend Kishore. I have very different views on these two questions than Kishore does. With regard to the question whether China can rise peacefully, I think the answer is no. My basic view is that what China is going to do as it continues to rise economically is that it's going to translate that economic might into military might, and it's going to try to dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. It's going to try to become a regional hegemon, the way the United States is a regional hegemon here in the Western Hemisphere. My view is that China would be crazy not to try to dominate Asia, because in a world where there is no policeman, no night watchman, it makes eminently good sense for a state to want to completely dominate its region. So I think that China will set out to do that. Of course, the United States does not tolerate peer competitors. The United States wants to remain the only regional hegemon in the world, and it therefore will go to great lengths to prevent China from dominating Asia. And the end result will be that you'll get this intense security competition with a serious chance of war. With regard to the second question, we're very early in this competition, so it is hard to predict who's ultimately going to prevail. I think when you read Kishore's excellent book and you listen to him over the years, he thinks that the Chinese have the wind behind their back and that the United States is kind of like a dinosaur. I would not bet on that, Kishore. If I had to bet, I'd bet on the United States. The United States has taken on 4 potential peer competitors in its history: Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union. The United States played a key role in putting all 4 of those countries, on the scrap heap of history. The United States will go to great lengths to compete with China and to prevent it from dominating Asia. And when you look at the demographics of China and the United States, and you look at the economies of the 2 countries, I think that the United States is in better shape than China is. And for that reason, if I had to bet, I'd bet on the United States.
China's so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, that's no way to win allies to its cause. Kishore.
Well, Tom, I'll try to speak to you as a friend of Australia. At the same time, I'm aware of how politically charged the atmosphere in Australia is, how strong the feelings against China are, and so it's very difficult now to speak out, frankly, on these things. But as a friend of Australia, I think it's important for Australians to grasp a few critical points. Number one, as I said, the era of Western domination of world history is over. And you're going to see the return of Asia. Now, Australia is not in Canada. Australia is in Asia. Now, as if all your neighbors have begun to carefully, gradually adjust to this new world that is emerging, and you insist on not changing or adapting to your new geopolitical environment, you will be creating problems for yourself. And, there's some iron laws of geopolitics. In fact, many of them are spelled out in John Mearsheimer's book, The Great Delusion. And I would say one of the iron laws of geopolitics is never pull the tail of a tiger. And at a time when the tiger is already angry and lots of people are throwing stones at this tiger, you decide at that point in time to pull the tail of the tiger. So there's some geopolitical wisdom in handling great powers carefully. This is, by the way, equally true of the United States too. If you're a neighbor of the United States, you just got to be careful in how you manage the United States. And as I think I read somewhere recently, John Mearsheimer saying in the book, how would the United States feel if suddenly the Russians came in and established bases in Mexico and in Canada? And John wisely said that, of course, the United States would get very upset. So every country, and I agree with John here, that every country will worry about what's happening in its neighborhood. So Australia has got to be aware it's in the neighborhood and has got to develop a certain degree of geopolitical sensitivity to this new environment. And so to put it very simply and very succinctly, Australia's got to reboot its entire strategic thinking and decide how it's going to adapt to a new world.
Well, following on from that, Kishore, John Mearsheimer, doesn't Kishore have a point that we need to be geopolitically sensitive to the rising power of China? It is our largest trading partner. It accounts for nearly 40% of our export wealth. We are in Australia probably heading into our worst recession since certainly the Great Depression in the 1930s. Aren't we vulnerable to China's economic coercion? What can we do to push back against these kind of Chinese threats? Should we become more diplomatic and move slowly but surely into the Chinese sphere of influence?
Well, I have a different view of what's happening in Asia and in the world more generally than Kishore. Kishore tends to see the situation in what I would call civilizational terms. He sounds a lot like Sam Huntington, right? He talks about Asia rising and the West declining. And it's as if Asia were this unified entity. And that's just not the case at all. The Japanese live in mortal fear of the Chinese, and both the Japanese and the Chinese, the last time I checked, are in Asia. The Indians are worried silly about the rise of China. So within Asia, you have all these cleavages, and you have a large number of countries in Asia that are economically tied to China in all sorts of ways, as you described Australia, but they also are strategically tied to the United States, and they're very fearful of China. I would say for those states, and this of course includes Australia, yes, you have economic interests that will push you to side with China, but you also have strategic interests that will push you to side with the United States. And the $64,000 question is, which way are you going to go? And the answer is, you're going to go with the United States, you're going to go with the Japanese, and you're going to do everything you can to contain China, because it is big and it is powerful and it is threatening.
Well, in other words, security trumps prosperity. Kishore, how would you respond to John Mearsheimer? Security trumps prosperity.
By the way, John will be very surprised to discover that I agree with him quite a lot. And I certainly agree with you, John, that Asia is this large and diverse place. And I agree with you, John, that countries like Japan and India, South Korea are all very worried about China's rise. It's a fact. Certainly I'd be very, of course, if there was a small cat next to me that suddenly became a tiger, I'd be very worried too, That's very natural. So, but at the same time, I would encourage Australia to watch how other Asians deal with China. For a simple example, which I think George Kennan would have endorsed, the first thing you do is don't insult a great power, right? The Japanese are very concerned, but at the same time, you notice how the Japanese are trying to make sure that their relations with China remain on an even keel. So everybody, yes, we have to deal with the new China. And Australia, unfortunately, has not accepted the fact that this is a different China that you have to deal with. And these adjustments, by the way, in Asia are very subtle, very, very subtle changes going on. And I also want to emphasize, I agree with John that most of the countries in this region want the US to stay on this region. They would like to see a strong US presence, but they would like to see a very tactful, diplomatic US presence that doesn't force countries to choose. So it is possible, actually, to work out arrangements whereby China can rise peacefully and we can all live in a relatively secure and stable environment.
Kishore, how do you respond to those folks, and they're not just the hawks in Washington or in Canberra, it's increasingly felt across Japan and South Korea, even in Europe, that China increasingly represents the number one strategic danger to the world, and moreover, the rest of the world must be less dependent on China for supply chains? Kishore.
Yes, I think it's very reasonable to say, it's an old proverb, don't put all your eggs in one basket. And I would say, yes, you have to certainly maybe reduce your reliance on China for the economic production. I think that's quite reasonable. But I want to emphasize, let's say, for example, take Japan. Japan is, as you know, to move Japanese investments outside China, to ensure Japan. And then, so where will the investment move? They'll move to ASEAN countries, to Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand. But guess what? This Japanese investment will boost ASEAN's growth. And as ASEAN's economy grows, they will trade more with China. So it's not a zero-sum game that we are playing at the end of the day on this economic sphere. And here, I just want to come back to a critical point that John was making earlier about how you manage China in this transition process. And I actually want to recommend a book that John wrote called American Diplomacy with a New Forward. And, George Kennan gave very, very good advice. And John, correct me if I got the advice right, for how to manage China. So, just very quickly, 4 pieces of advice. Number one, your success will depend on your domestic spiritual vitality, what you do at home. Number 2, cultivate friends and allies. Number 3, don't insult the Soviet Union because you got to deal with the Soviet Union. Number 4, be humble. So, frankly, if the United States of America applied George Kennan's advice at the beginning of the Cold War in the management of China, we would have a very different world. And we could manage the rise of China in such a way that our interests, whatever you call your interests, are not necessarily jeopardized. You can actually find ways and means of working with each other. And that's what we should be striving to do. I'm not saying you should kowtow to China or jump at China's behest, but what you need to do is find intelligent ways and means of dealing with the new rising power.
Well, John Mearsheimer, all the available public opinion polling evidence indicates that the Americans are increasingly anxious about China. Anti-China sentiments are rising. This is bipartisan, both Democrats and Republicans. Why can't America take Kishore's advice and be humble and be more sensitive about China's enhancing regional profile? John?
Because the United States cannot tolerate a situation where any great power dominates all of Asia, or any great power dominates all of Europe. The United States has a rich history of contesting any country that tries to dominate its region of the world and become a peer competitor of the United States. From a realist point of view, and as you both know, I'm a realist par excellence. In an anarchic system where there's no higher authority, it's very important to be powerful. It's very important to be more powerful than the other states in the system because that's the best way to survive. The Chinese understand this intuitively. They understand it explicitly. They understand that during the century of national humiliation, the biggest problem was that they were weak. They didn't have much power. They intend to have lots of power. They want to dominate Asia, but we don't want them to dominate Asia. One thing that I think that Kishore and I disagree on is I think international politics is very much a zero-sum game. As China gains, we lose. As we gain, China loses. And this is one of the reasons I think the competition is so intense. Now, if I can just make one more point. Kishore, you keep talking about George Kennan. George Kennan was the father of containment. He was interested in containing the Soviet Union. I'm interested in containing China.
I don't know. I'm sure you know him better than I do, but knowing him and his writings, he was also very shrewd and very realistic. As you know, he opposed the Iraq war that the U.S. blundered into, and I think if he was alive today, if he's a realist, and if you are a realist, you got to consider the first question is it realistic to think that you can contain China in the same way that you contain the Soviet Union? Because China is the exact opposite of the Soviet Union. Because China actually you're absolutely right. The Chinese want to become strong and dominant. They anticipated this containment strategy even 20, 30 years ago, and therefore made sure that all of their neighbors traded more with China than they did with the United States. So you mentioned the 5 allies of the United States in East Asia: South Korea, Japan, Thailand, Philippines, Australia. Unless I'm wrong, all 5 do more trade with China than they do with United States. So it is an absolute mistake to think that you can take some of the assumptions of the Soviet Union and apply them to China, because China is in many ways, and this is, of course, John will completely disagree with me on this, is a much more careful, strategic player. So, for example, I agree that China will try to become the dominant power, but China will try to become the dominant power without using military means. And Henry Kissinger, in his book on China, describes how the Chinese believe that the best way to win a war, as Sun Tzu said, is without fighting it. So the Chinese will become more assertive, their influence will grow. But the thing to note about China is that as it is rising as a great power, it hasn't fought a major war in 40 years. It hasn't fired a bullet across its border in 30 years. So it's a very different animal that you're competing with than when you're dealing with the Soviet Union. So it's important to discard some of the previous methods if you want to deal with an assertive China.
Question for John Mearsheimer. What spark would likely provoke hostilities with China? Can you please address the issue of Taiwan? Will China and the US go to war over Taiwan? One glance at the map would favour China in that question. John Mearsheimer.
Well, I think there are three main hot spots in East Asia. One is the South China Sea, where the Chinese are engaging in building islets and turning those small mounds of territory in the South China Sea into military bases. The second is Taiwan. And the third is the East China Sea, where there are these rocks that are contested between Japan on one side and China on the other. Those are the three hot spots in East Asia. I think the most likely place where you would get a war between the United States and China, where you would actually have shooting, is over the South China Sea. I think that it's also possible that you could have a war over those other two contingencies, one being Taiwan, two being the East China Sea. With regard to Taiwan, there's no question, as Jennifer said in her question, that Taiwan is physically very close to the Chinese mainland, and it is roughly 6,000 miles from the California coast. So as time goes by, it becomes more and more difficult for the United States to defend Taiwan. It's a very tough contingency. I think that if you look at the military balance in Asia, Tom, it favors the United States now, and this is true with regard to defending Taiwan. But as time goes by and China becomes economically and militarily more powerful, it becomes increasingly difficult for the United States to defend Taiwan, to fight a conflict in the South China Sea or the East China Sea.
You have to know the history of how Taiwan became separated from China. And earlier on, John referred to the century of humiliation that China suffered. And as you know, during the century of humiliation from 1842 to 1949, the British came, forced China to accept opium, seize Hong Kong, seize territories in China, had settlements and sacked the Summer Palace. And then, of course, the Japanese came and defeated the Chinese in 1895 and seized Taiwan. So Taiwan, the most important thing as far as the Chinese are concerned, is the last symbol of the century of humiliation that China has suffered. So I can tell you that if any, you talk of the people's sentiments, any Chinese leader who appears in the eyes of 1.4 billion people to be weak on Taiwan, he is toast, because it's seen as the last symbol of what's happening. So you want to factor in the sentiments of people, be careful what you're doing to the sentiments of 1.4 billion people. But having said that, I also believe that there can be a peaceful solution to the Taiwan issue. And it's a simple case of live and let live. And as you know, paradoxically, the geopolitical space of Taiwan under President Ma Ying-jeou, they were allowed to participate in World Health Organization, increased when the Taiwanese didn't have a government that wants to push for any kind of independence. But the minute the Taiwanese government tries to push for independence, its geopolitical space shrinks. So if you really want to help the people of Taiwan, and I want to help the people of Taiwan, at the end of the day, the Taiwanese have got to be realistic and realize that there are, 193 countries in the world, right? Apart from a few mini states that recognize Taiwan, none of the major states are going to recognize Taiwan. And, Taiwan's fate was sealed in 1979 when the United States de-recognized Taiwan and recognized China as the government. So once that happened, that's when history turned the corner. So it's a difficult issue, but the best way we can help the people of Taiwan is try not to politicize the issue, and that will give them more space in the geopolitical environment.
好，以上就是马凯硕和约翰·米尔斯海默在这场线上辩论中精彩观点的节选。在这段浓缩的内容中，我们听到了两位学者围绕中国崛起、中美关系和地区热点问题展开深度交锋。马凯硕从历史和亚洲的角度出发，认为中国的崛起是历史常态的回归，并主张通过非军事手段来扩大影响力。他呼吁西方国家应以更智慧、更细腻的方式应对一个正在转型中的中国，避免不必要的挑衅，寻求共存共赢的路径。而米尔斯海默则坚定地站在现实主义立场，强调在无政府状态的国际体系中，大国竞争是不可避免。他认为中国一旦崛起，必然会谋求地区主导地位，而美国也一定会全力遏制。这种结构性的对抗让冲突的风险难以避免。他对亚洲独特思维的概念持保留态度，认为大国行为的逻辑在全球范围内都是一样的。两位在澳大利亚的战略学者如何理解乔治·凯南的遏制理论，以及台湾问题的未来走向等议题上，展现出了鲜明的分歧和深刻的洞见。至于谁的判断更贴近现实，未来的发展会验证谁的观点正确，这个问题就留给大家自己思考和判断了。好，本期的分享就到这里，感谢大家的收看，我们下次见。